Well, thank you very much to everyone that's joined this evening. I'm Chris. I'm an executive committee member for Team Global. So for those that haven't joined before, Team Global, it was founded in 1958 as the European Atlantic Movement and is an independent, apolitical educational foundation. And Team aims to enable young people to act as global citizens and to aspire to leadership roles within their communities. So we empower them to consider world issues and to take their part in resolving problems and promoting solutions. So we work alongside students through our student-led initiative, The International Perspective, in which a team of students help their peers and wider society to be more aware of international issues. Through webinars such as this, we are engaging with students across the UK to think globally on a range of issues ranging from cybersecurity, global inequality, and in the case of this webinar, Britain's future economic relationship with the EU. So a quick introduction to Stephen and the Institute of Economic Affairs. So the IEA is the UK's original free market think tank, founded in 1955. Their mission is to improve the understanding of fundamental institutions of a free society by analysing and expounding the role of markets in solving economic and social problems. Given the current economic challenges facing Britain and the wider global environment, it is more vital than ever that we promote the intellectual case for a free economy, low taxes, freedom in education, health and welfare, and lower levels of regulation, according to IEA. The IEA also challenges people to think about the correct role of institutions, property rights, and the role of law in creating a society that fosters innovation, entrepreneurship, and the efficient use of environmental resources. So a quick introduction to Stephen. So Dr. Stephen Davies is the head of education at the IEA. Previously, he was program officer at the Institute of Humane Studies at George Mason University in Virginia. He joined IHS from the UK, where he was a senior lecturer in the Department of History and Economic History at Manchester Metropolitan University. And he is also a visiting scholar at the Social Philosophy and Policy Center at Bowling Green State University, Ohio. A historian, he graduated from St Andrews University in Scotland in 1976 and gained his PhD from the same institution in 1984. He's authored several books, including Empiricism and History, published in 2003, and was the co-editor with Nigel Ashford of the Dictionary of Conservative and Libertarian Thought, published in 1991. Thank you for joining us, Stephen, this evening. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Chris. I would add, given the subject of the talk I'm about to give you, that I have a more recent book on the economics and politics of Brexit, which you can get through various kind of online retailers. It explains, amongst other things, exactly why the process of Brexit proved to be so torturous and confusing for many people, not at all really due to the haplessness of the then Prime Minister. It was to do with a number of other things. I've also got a book just come out recently on the Streetwise Guide to the Devil. I wanted to call it The Life and Times of Satan, but the publisher wouldn't let me. Right, so what I'm going to talk about now, as you heard, is Britain's future economic relationship with the EU. And although I'm going to be talking about the economic relationship, I will say something about the kind of geopolitics of this as well, because the nature of world trade these days, as I'll be saying in a moment, is inextricably intertwined with geopolitical considerations. And I'm going to say something about the background to this, and then something about the outcome of Brexit, the form that Brexit actually took as a result of the process that followed on the referendum, and then what the various options are for both the UK government and the EU going forward, and the kind of policy considerations that lie behind the decisions that may or may not be taken, which include, and this is where some of the geopolitics comes in, now, non-strictly economic considerations. Now, the background, first of all, you have a key part of the background, Sainz made it a second ago really, is the nature of trade in the modern world. Because although we hear a lot of talk about free trade agreements, that's actually a rather misleading term. Since 19 1944, the end of World War II and the Bretton Woods Agreement, and then subsequently after World War II, the setting up of GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, we haven't had anything like the kind of world of free trade that we had in the 19th century up until the outbreak of the Great War in 1914. Free trade in those days did actually mean, quite simply, no tariffs and goods simply going quite freely without any check or hindrance from one part of the world to another. Now, the world that grew up after World War II is quite different, because the major barriers to trade in the modern world are not tariffs. Tariffs as a sort of cost on total global trade are actually quite negligible now. They amount to about a 2.5% cost on total trade by most people's calculations. The major obstructions to free trade, or the free movement of goods and services between different parts of the world now, is competing regulations, because we now live in a world with much more extensive and detailed economic regulation of various kinds, things like product standards, production, and other kinds of regulations and controls of one sort and another. And typically, the reason why you can't buy a product from another country in any other part of the world will be because the regulatory regimes are incompatible. The product in question does not satisfy the regulatory requirements of the country that you're living in and trying to buy it from. And so what we call free trade agreements are actually more correctly described as regulatory harmonization agreements, which is one of the reasons why they're so incredibly long. The free trade agreement between Britain and France that was signed in 1860 was only about 4 pages long, whereas the kind of trade agreements you get now run to thousands of pages of incredibly detailed and specific agreements. And that's because they're all about trying to create a similar kind of harmony between the regulatory regimes of different parts of the world. Now, what that means in turn is that politics, and ultimately geopolitics, is inevitably entwined with trade relations and economic relations of all kinds these days, particularly for manufactured goods, but also for services. And what that in turn means is that the ability to set the regulatory standards is a crucial aspect of what is known colloquially as soft power. In other words, non-military forms of political power. And if you look at the world economy as it is now, there are essentially 3 regulatory great powers, parts of the world which are such large market players in terms of the volume of goods and services that they consume and create, that the regulations that they create tend to be adopted by other countries, because if you don't adopt them, you can't sell into or participate in those markets. And those 3 big players in the regulatory regime are the United States, China, and the European Union. Now, you can be a highly successful trading economy without being integrated into or totally dependent upon any one of those 3 players. The obvious example of a country which has managed that is Japan, but it's quite difficult, and it's not at all easy in certain sectors, particularly agriculture, but also a number of others. Now, this is highly relevant for the situation which the UK finds itself in post-Brexit, given the way that that process worked out. So that's the first part of the background context that you need to know about. The nature and significance of trade regulation and trade controls these days. And you should forget about the kind of language that is commonly used to describe trade agreements. These are not about free trade in any kind of meaningful sense of that term. They're more about regulated trade and harmonizing the different kind of regulations that different sovereign states impose upon economic activity in their territory, so that the inhabitants of those states can now trade freely with each other without regulatory barriers getting in the way. So that's the first background point. The second background point is the nature of the trade relationship between the UK and the EU, the rest of the EU before Brexit, and the EU as a separate entity since Brexit. And the way this has been developing and changing since roughly the early 2000s. Now, at the moment, in 2020, a couple of years ago now, the EU had 46% of total British trade. So it was responsible for just under half of all of the UK's total trade, easily our biggest single trading partner, but not, you'll notice, a majority. It was a very large part, but still not over 50%. Now, it accounted for 42% of exports and 50% of imports. So exactly 50% of all of the goods and services imported into the UK in 2020 came from the EU. 42% of the goods and services exported by the UK in 2020 went to the EU. Now, to put that into perspective, the United States accounted for 20% of exports and 13% of imports. And it's the most important single country trading partner of the UK. If you disaggregate the EU into different countries, then none of them, apart perhaps from Germany, comes close to the United States as a trading partner. But obviously, it makes more sense to aggregate all the EU countries together. Now, the nature of that trade is that Britain in 2020, as had been the case for quite some time, was running a significant trade deficit with the EU. The value of the goods and services sold to the EU was significantly less than the cost of the imports from the EU. Now, in invisible trade, as it's called, services, the UK was actually running a £37 billion surplus. So this means things like financial services primarily, but also law, tourism, things of that sort. In that sector, the UK was actually running a pretty healthy and hefty surplus. But in goods, it was running an £87 billion deficit. So there was a really significant trade deficit in terms of goods, particularly manufactured goods. Because when you start to break down that trade balance in 2020, what you will discover is that by far the largest part of that deficit was made up of road vehicles, German cars, trucks and buses, basically. And also, it's worth saying that the bulk of the deficit, I'll say more about this in a moment, was with one particular EU member state, which is Germany. The second one will probably surprise you. Now, if we look at that, in fact, there was a 17 billion trade deficit with Germany alone in 2020. The second biggest deficit, and this will probably surprise many of you, was with Belgium, amounting to 10.2 billion. You might imagine that was with beer and chocolates, but actually, again, it was mainly with manufactured goods. It's primarily goods that actually were exported to the UK through Belgium. It doesn't necessarily mean goods that were made in Belgium itself. Italy, there was a deficit of 6.8 billion. The Netherlands, there was a deficit of 7 billion, but that's complicated by what's known as the Rotterdam effect, which is that goods are imported into Rotterdam and then exported directly out to the UK. Poland, a deficit of 6.6 billion, Spain, a deficit of 7.8 billion, despite all the, a lot of that is tourism, basically, that accounts for that. The only country in the whole of the EU with which Britain had a surplus in terms of goods was the Republic of Ireland, where there was a surplus of 18.1 billion. So the pattern is therefore very clear that there's an overall pretty substantial trade deficit between the EU and the UK at the moment, and that deficit is driven by manufacturing goods being imported mainly from Germany, but to some extent other countries. France, by the way, is, along with the rest of the EU, got a very small trade deficit. Doesn't really amount to very much. Now, when you put that 2020 figure into a longer term perspective, though, what you realize is that since the early 2000s, Britain's trade pattern has been gradually decoupling from the EU because there's been a significant decline in exports to the EU and a less marked but still quite noticeable and steady decline in imports from the EU. So, for example, in 2006, 54% of British exports went to the EU. As you'll know, to go back to a moment ago, now it's only 42%. So there's been a decline from 54% of exports in 2006 to only 42% of exports in 2020. And that's a pretty stable, steady decline. Now, in terms of imports, in 2002, 58% of imports came from the EU. So it was by far the largest source of imports into the British economy. That remains stable until roughly 2006, and then there's a decline. Then it's stable roughly between 2014 and 18, and since then there's been a decline again. And so if you go back there, in 2002, it's 58% of imports. Now it's 50%. So there's a decline, not as big as the decline of exports, but still quite a noticeable one. Now, it's quite noticeable that the reason for the decline in imports from the EU is that we're importing less services. We are still importing as many manufactured goods from the EU as we ever did, but we're importing less in the way of services of one kind or another. Conversely, in terms of exports, the main reason is that there's been a decline in goods export to the EU, but this has been balanced by a significant growth in exports of goods to the rest of the world. So the long-term trend is for the UK's export trade in particular to reorient away from the EU. And this is a trend which precedes Brexit by well over a decade, and it's quite clearly a long-term secular trend. On the other hand, we're still importing a lot of German cars and other things from the EU, but we're buying less in the way of services from them. Now, it's worth saying that the UK has a significant trade surplus with the rest of the world. Although it's running a big deficit with the EU, it's running a significant trade surplus with the rest of the world. And this has grown every year since 2009. And it's been growing since 2011. So the UK's exports to the rest of the world have been rising, whereas its imports from the rest of the world have been stable or slightly declining over that period. And that's another aspect of the reorientation of Britain's export trade away from the EU towards the rest of the world. Where are those British exports going? What are the parts of the rest of the world that are increasingly providing markets for British exports? Well, it's primarily North America, the United States, but also Canada, but also the Far East and other parts of the world. No individual country other than the United States amounts for a great deal, but they obviously all add up to a considerable amount. And so that's the pattern that you can clearly see. So that's the other part of the background. One part, as I say, is the nature of trade. The other part of the background is the way in which, even before Brexit, in fact, long before Brexit, British trade was gradually disengaging from the EU, most notably in the field of exports, with the EU, in fact, being responsible for virtually all of Britain's visible trade deficit. And that deficit has been growing slightly over recent years. Now, what happened with Brexit? Well, I'm not going to go into why Brexit happened, but the outcome, of course, was that originally, when the vote to leave the EU won in the referendum, there was no clear idea about what would then happen. And the common expectation was that the UK would go for what was known colloquially as the Norway option, which means that it would remain within the European single market and the common external tariff, but be free of the political aspects of the EU. This, however, was a non-starter in the Conservative Party, not least because the EU very reasonably made it very clear that that would require accepting all three of the key freedoms as they're known, of the single market. Above all, the freedom of movement, of migration within the single market area. And because immigration had been a key issue in the referendum, there was absolutely no way that the Conservative Party in Parliament would accept that. And the EU very reasonably would not allow them to cherry pick and have some of the freedoms of the single market, but not the rest. So the question then was, well, what kind of terms could be negotiated? What Theresa May finally, after a lot of very hard bargaining, got out of the EU was an agreement which effectively left the UK in the single market for a very long period. And a so-called backstop was agreed, which meant that if the further details could not be worked out, a barrier, a trade barrier, would have to be introduced between the Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK in order to prevent the emergence of a hard border in Ireland, which otherwise would become the EU was going to impose. Important to notice it's the EU that would have imposed this, by the way, in order to protect the single market. Now, what happened, of course, was that was thrown out by Parliament because a large block of what you might call unreconciled Remain MPs thought that if they could destroy any option of a so-called soft deal, like the one that Theresa May had put forward, then they would be left with only the choice between having a second referendum or even just staying in and so-called hard Brexit. And they thought that given that kind of choice, they would get what they wanted, which was Britain remaining in the EU. However, they miscalculated badly. And what they did, in fact, was land the UK with, in some ways, their worst possible outcome, which is what we got thanks to Boris Johnson's agreement and the subsequent election in 2019, which of course he won. And that is not a complete hard Brexit, but something very, very close to it. Britain is no longer in the single market. It is no longer in the single market regime. It is no longer bound by the regulatory regime, which is what the single market is basically, that the EU has constructed. Now, on the one hand, this presents great opportunities, but on the other hand, it also presents enormous challenges. Remember the point I started off with. In the world we now live in, the key thing that determines trade, flows of both investment and manufactured goods and services, is ultimately, apart from geography and things of that sort, the regulatory regimes in force in different parts of the world. The EU is a regulatory superpower. It's one of the three big ones, as I said, along with the US and China. Now, what the UK government has chosen to do, by virtue of the withdrawal agreement it negotiated, is to withdraw from one of those three regulatory regimes. So what does this mean going forward? Well, what it means is that the UK government, on the one hand, has a whole range of options open to it. It can now choose to scrap, alter, change a whole lot of EU regulations, any or all of them, depending on what it wants to do. It can relax regulations, or it can make them more stringent. It's entirely up to it. The point is, it has reasserted its own regulatory independence. So, for example, in agriculture, it no longer is bound by the Common Agricultural Policy, and therefore it doesn't have to have the subsidy regime of the CAP, and it can regulate, it can adopt, for example, regulations with regard to things like hormone feeding to livestock, which would enable it to import cheap meat from the United States. Just one example, for instance. However, the downside of this is that a lot of the rest of the world has basically adopted EU regulatory standards because they want to be able to sell to the EU. And so what that means is that those countries are going to be reluctant to let British goods into them, or it will make negotiating trade agreements with them much, much more difficult. Now, there are many parts of the world where this does not apply. Large India, for example, or parts of East and Southeast Asia. There, trade with the EU is a relatively small part of those parts of the world's trade, or to the extent that there is trade, the problem of regulatory impediments doesn't really arise for various reasons. And so it is possible for the UK to negotiate trade agreements with these parts of the world. The problem is that at the moment, these only amount to a relatively small part, or in many cases a very small part, of total UK trade, whether imports or exports. And so if trade with the EU declines, it's not clear that these areas of the world will grow rapidly enough to enable the British, to make up for any loss of trade with the EU. Now, how much trade there will be lost in terms of trade with the EU is hard to say. As I said, for a long time now, British trade, both imports and exports, has been reorienting away from the EU anyway. It may well be that Brexit simply accelerates that trend, but what we can't tell at the moment is just how much it may have accelerated it. There has been a huge drop in trade between Britain and the EU in the last 2 years. But of course, the problem is that that's mostly due to the pandemic and the lockdowns. It's almost impossible to disentangle the effects of the pandemic and the lockdowns that it brought as a consequence from the effects of Brexit. We will have a much clearer idea of what the effect of Brexit is in another 2 or 3 years' time as the effects of the pandemic wind down. Right now, pretty much any country in Europe has seen a major decline in trade with other countries in the EU, simply because of the effect of the effective economic shutdown imposed in most parts of Europe once the COVID virus made its way over here a couple of years ago. So we still don't really know just how much the trade has been. But what this does mean is that the British government now faces a strategic kind of choice. One choice is to make the fullest possible use of the opportunities that it now has to set its own regulations, and to try to do so in a way which will, if you like, add impetus to that long-term trend of reorienting British trade away from the EU, opening up more export markets in other parts of the world, for example, but also opening up new imports, maybe making it easier to import goods from, say, the Far East or the United States. On the other hand, it might choose to do essentially what Theresa May was trying to do through the agreement she had negotiated, which is to continue very close trade relations with the EU. And there are obvious reasons why you might want to do this, not least because of what is known as the gravity effect, which is that, generally speaking, for obvious reasons, people or parts of the world will tend to conduct the bulk of their trade with parts of the world that are closest to them geographically. Now, it's worth saying that there's a lot of dispute about this amongst academic economists. Not all economists accept the gravity principle, or they argue, a lot of them, that it applies differently to different parts of the world. Essentially, the more easy access you have to the world's oceans, the less the gravity principle applies. The reason for that is quite simple. Even now, it remains the fact, as it has done for the whole of human history, that it is far easier and cheaper to move goods around the world by water than by any other means, and particularly by land. This is why landlocked countries suffer a significant impediment to growth compared to countries that have access to the world's oceans. Now, what that means is that if, like Britain, you have relatively easy and unimpeded access to most of the world's oceans and oceanic trade routes, your trade is going to be less clearly oriented towards your nearby geographic neighbours, because the cost of shipping goods, say, from Liverpool to the United States is not that much higher than the cost of shipping goods via Rotterdam into, let's say, Eastern or Central Europe, because the land journey from Rotterdam to, say, Budapest is more expensive by quite a margin, even today, than is the case from Liverpool to, say, New York or Boston. So there is an argument, an academic argument, to the effect that this is less of a problem than you might imagine. But it's the major choice that the British government now has to take. And the problem for the political problem of the British government is that if they choose to basically stick with the EU regulatory regime, it does raise the question of why they went for the kind of Brexit they did anyway. Now, from the EU's point of view, they have a strategic interest or a political interest in not making things too easy for the British government. Because what they do not want to do is to have Britain leave the EU and then become very, very successful economically, because they fear this will give other countries in the EU similar ideas. That's the basic fear, that there's a threat to the project, if you will, of the EU. This is particularly strongly felt in France. Not least because President Macron has very ambitious ideas for the way in which he thinks the EU ought to go. And he sees Britain's leaving the EU and leaving the regulatory regime of the EU in particular as a serious threat to his grand design, if you will. So that means that the EU is likely to not basically be very accommodating to any requests that the UK government may make for changes in its regulatory regime while still having access to the EU market. They're much more likely to throw up objections. The Irish case, which I'll leave to questions and answers, is the obvious question in point here. And Ireland, I think, is fair to say, is being used as a cat's paw, essentially, by the major forces in the EU, France and Germany, as part of this standoff with the UK government post-Brexit. That said, the EU must also be very careful, because they don't want to actually dramatically accelerate that reorientation of trade that I spoke about at the start. Because if they do, it could well be that in a couple of years' time, the UK's trade with the EU has shrunk to past a certain kind of tipping point as a share of its total trade. So at the moment, as I say, it's about 46%. Let's say, for the sake of argument, it drops below 40% within 4 or 5 years. At that point, the EU has much less leverage over the UK, and it's much more likely the UK will simply write off a lot of the trade links it might otherwise have. The other player in this whole game is the United States. And this is where the geopolitics comes in. The United States might be the obvious trading partner for the UK to try and reorient itself towards, given that it's one of the other two major regulatory superpowers, and also the largest single trading partner that the UK has outside the EU. However, the US's geopolitical view is, and has been for a very long time, that it wants the UK to be part of the EU or very closely connected to it. This has nothing to do with economics. It has to do with the American grand strategy and the view that they take of how they want the world to run. And if anything, the US is going to be even more committed to that view following the war in Ukraine and the perceived threat from China and the pivot towards focusing more on geopolitical competition with China in the Pacific and South Asia and away from Europe. They don't want complications and mess going on the eastern side of the Atlantic, basically. So certainly the current administration in the US and probably any future US administration, even if the Republicans were to regain the White House in a couple of years' time, is not likely to be sympathetic to Britain, if you like, going its own way. Quite apart from any other problems that might arise, because one of my own view is that actually negotiating a trade deal with the United States will be extremely difficult because of the way the US Congress works, which I think people in this country often don't really appreciate. So that's the situation that the UK finds itself in. It has great opportunities open to it, but at the same time, it's also in a bit of a difficult situation right now. And the question really is how it chooses to get through the next 5 years. As I say, we can't really tell what the pattern of trade has happened to the pattern of trade at the moment, because all the statistics are distorted by the effects and impact of the pandemic. But we'll have a much clearer idea in 2 or 3 years' time. So at that point, I'll stop and see what questions you have for me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Stephen. It's been really, really insightful, and I'm sure we'll have lots of exciting questions to come. So I suppose Anthony's just popped a question in the chat now, asking sort of what percentage of the UK economy are services?
It's a clear majority. I forget the exact figure, but it's well over 50%. I think it's something like 60-something percent So the UK, and this has been the case for a long time, by the way. Britain has had a majority services economy since the 1920s. People forget how far back that goes. But of course, it's become much more marked um, since the 1990s, basically. People think that the decline of manufacturing as a share of the British economy really happened under Thatcher, but actually that's not true. As a share of GDP, manufacturing was exactly the same when Thatcher left office as it was when she took office. The difference was that it employed a lot fewer people. So it's become much more efficient in terms of its labour uses. But it was still the same share of GDP. The significant decline in manufacturing as a share of GDP, which is from the high 20s to the mid-teens, took place under New Labour, under Gordon Brown and Tony Blair. Not that I blame them for it. I think this reflected wider global changes, but that's when it happened.
Brilliant, thank you. And I suppose I've got a question of my own. Obviously, you mentioned sort of the bilateral trade deals have been, they're still ongoing with so many different economies across the globe. There's one thing that's been sort of in the news quite recently in terms of the Brexit opportunities. Obviously, Jacob Rees-Mogg was put in charge of finding out those opportunities for us. Have we seen any so far? If so, what are they? Or if not, will we ever discover?
Well, at the moment, it appears to be mainly to do with things like reintroducing imperial measures, which I must say, personally, I'm old enough that I would quite welcome that because I still think in imperial measures. But I think for anybody under the age of about 40, that will be a bit of a nightmare, quite honestly. So not a lot has come up yet, apart from gimmicks, quite frankly. There could be major opportunities, I think, particularly in agriculture, the area I mentioned, also in a number of other areas, such as pharmaceuticals and in certain kinds of industry, particularly electronics. But the problem is, as I sort of intimated in my remarks, that it's all very well changing your own internal regulations to perhaps make your agricultural sector more efficient or try and develop a pharmaceutical manufacturing sector, which we already have, one of the most successful ones of actually in the UK. With a number of global leaders like GlaxoSmithKline and so on. But the problem is that you can't then sell those products to other parts of the world freely and easily unless the regulations you have are compatible with the ones that other parts of the world have, or you can persuade them to accept them. So this is why you have all these bilateral trade agreements. And as you say, they take forever to negotiate because they require taking two very complicated sets of regulations and trying to find some way in which they can be made compatible. And this is an incredibly complicated, technically difficult process. Not only that, it's very prone to produce a capture. So if you're a major company, a multinational firm or a large domestic firm, you can stand to gain an awful lot by having the regulations written in a way that will suit you, because you can use it to exclude competitors, for example, and get yourself a monopoly rent essentially in the market. And so the whole process becomes very torturous. Now, there is an alternative. The alternative is the system that, for example, applies to trade between Australia and New Zealand. And this is called a mutual recognition and respect treaty. What happens there is that two countries, let's say for the sake of argument, it's Britain and Malaysia, purely for the sake of argument. Instead of going through all the regulations and trying to harmonize them, you simply say, we have confidence in each other's regulatory capacity. Any goods that pass the regulatory threshold in country A, Malaysia in this case, will be freely traded and saleable in country B, the United Kingdom, and vice versa, with the following exclusions. And you then have a list of areas where that doesn't apply. Otherwise, you have this principle of mutual respect. That's much quicker and much easier. So why do governments not do this? Well, because essentially it involves losing control. Because it means that maybe the other country has a different regulatory regime. You can't control what they do. That's their business. But you still have to buy their goods. And they may be cheaper, better than goods produced under your regulatory regime, and so people buy them, the consumers buy them rather than your own stuff. So what do? You may well have to change your regime. Now, personally, I think that's a good thing, because what that means is you have regulatory competition, and you find out through a discovery process, market competition, which regulations are best for consumers. But of course, many people aren't interested simply in regulation as a means to provide goods at the lowest possible cost to consumers. They want those regulations to achieve other ends, such as environmental protection, for example, or animal rights, or animal welfare protection, this kind of thing. And so they're not at all happy about that prospect. And so a mutual recognition treaty is much, much easier. But the problem is, from the point of view of the political process, that you've given up the control, a great deal of political control. So that's why at the moment there's great resistance to this. Personally, I think that's the way we should go, but I don't expect the politicians to do it anytime soon.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think that comes on quite nicely to Aaron's point. And he states the UK trade marketing in the US is quite weak. Obviously, the US is a much larger country than the UK. So he states that it's really a hand-to-hand business sort of tactical approach. Could you perhaps expand on that, off your
Yes,
thoughts?
very much. I mean, I think that's absolutely correct. We talk glibly about the US, and what most people who haven't been there don't realize is what an enormous place it is. I mean, it is, it's a continent-sized country. I remember once very vividly the first time I was in the United States going on a drive in Virginia, and my girlfriend at the time said to me after 8 hours, have we got to Mississippi yet? Said, no, we're still in Virginia. And I had to explain to her we were undertaking the equivalent of a drive from Manchester to Milan. Now, the point is there's an incredible amount of local variation. And the US economy, below the level of the 100 or so major corporations, which are essentially clients of the federal government, is broken up into an incredibly large number of small firms, many of them quite localized. So the question is, how do you both source goods from that economy and how do you sell into it? And you're up against a number of things, not least the insularity and solipsism of the American consumer, which is a huge barrier to overcome, as people in the music business will tell you. Give just one obvious example, but you can do it. But I think the way to do it is not through government. Quite honestly, the only thing the British government can do is to try and eliminate as many of the barriers that are put in place by either our own government or more often the US Congress as possible. But really, the people who ought to be engaged in this are things like the British Chambers of Commerce and other organisations of that sort, through the formation of direct business-to-business links with local chambers of commerce and other organisations within the 50 states, or even below the level of the states, because many of these states have California is the world's seventh largest economy by itself, for example. So what you need is those kind of very granular, local level business-to-business links, and this is an obvious area commerce, or indeed trade councils and other kinds of organizations of that sort. The most that the government can do, I think, is to provide a kind of reasonable regulatory and legal framework. You can't have a kind of export-led strategy, or for that matter, an import sourcing strategy done at government level in this case. I think that's a mug's game, particularly with a country as complex and varied as the United States actually is. People who tell you the US is all the same everywhere have never been there. It's an incredibly varied country internally.
Brilliant, thank you. And a question that's come from Lynn before I move on to Anthony's question. She reversed back, I think it's a couple months now, where we had the big issue of the firing and rehiring of the P&O ferry workforce. Do you think that now that we've left the EU, there's a threat for deregulation for UK workers' rights? Obviously, I think all of the workers in the EU didn't experience anything like that. So do you think that that's something that we need to work on post-Brexit?
Well, actually, that practice, fire and rehire as it's called, was allowed under the existing EU regulations. I mean, there hasn't been a change in labour market regulations has made this possible. And in fact, this kind of thing has been going on for a very long time. It's obviously got a lot of attention because the P&O case was so egregious and so dramatic that it attracted a lot of attention. But actually, it's been going on for a long time. So it isn't a case of will the UK, soften up labour market regulation. It's already pretty relaxed. One of the reasons for that is, and this is often misunderstood, the EU does have a single market regulation regime, but within that regime, there's considerable scope for national variation. And in terms of labour market regulation in particular, the scope is much more widespread than it is in other areas. So the French labour market, for example, is much more highly regulated than the British one. Similarly, the German and Italian labour market is very highly regulated compared to the British one. The British, along with a number of others, like the Dutch and the Swedish one, interestingly, much less regulated than those other examples. And so we were already at one end, if you like, of a spectrum of labour market regulation, which allowed things like this to happen. It's a political matter as to whether you want to do this or not. One of the interesting questions facing the British government now is, do they want to take measures to build up or revive the British merchant marine? Because we used to have easily the world's largest merchant marine. Now, there are still quite a lot of shipping firms which are British owned or based in the UK, but virtually all of their ships are no longer registered here. They sail under what are called flags of convenience, which are places like Liberia, Panama, and other places. The reason being that if you register the ship in those countries, the relations you have with your crew are much more relaxed. Now, one of the big strategic questions I think the British government does have to think about is, do they want to revive the merchant marine? They might well decide to, if you like, go all the way back to something like the Navigation Acts and encourage the formation of a British-owned but also British crewed merchant marine. Personally, I think that would not be a smart move, but they might well think of doing it as part of a wider economic strategy. I think probably the most likely future is that they're going to tighten labour market regulations. And I think that the kind of thing that P&O have done, which is basically, they've done it, by the way, because they're completely broke. I mean, that's why they've done this. They're on their uppers financially, and they're in severe danger of just going belly up. But anyway, regardless of that, I think they're going to be one of the last firms to do this. And I think that being in Brexit is going to affect that one way or the other.
Brilliant, thank you. And coming to Anthony's point, he touched on that money laundering is said to be worth 160 billion to the UK economy. Obviously, with the sanctions going on Russia at the moment, and obviously the EU just announced another set of sanctions on oil. How do you think the UK economy is going to be affected by this?
Not very much. The reason why I say that very confidently is this. Yes, there are sanctions being imposed at the moment on money laundering and things of that sort, but they're targeted very specifically at Russians and Russian oligarchs. So this may harm a few estate agents in Chelsea, but it's not going to have a major effect. Money laundering, whatever you want to call it, is a major part of the UK economy, not least because of money being routed through the British Crown dependencies, places like the Cayman Islands, Turks and Caicos Islands, British Virgin Islands, the Channel Islands, a whole bunch of territories around the globe. So-called tax havens, which are basically the kind of plumbing of the world capital system. They're the means by which money flows around the world investment system without being subject to taxation. That's essentially what they are. When people say money is parked in Bermuda or the Cayman Islands, and the implication is it's sat there doing nothing, like a big pile of notes, that is rubbish, because the money is not doing nothing, it's being invested in various things. So the point is that it's more like plumbing, as I say. You need to think of places like the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, as being essentially the routes or conduits by which large wealthy corporations and individuals move their money around the planet without it incurring tax charges in the process. And Britain is at the centre of this. And so it is a major part of the British economy, as you rightly say. The sanctions are not going to have much effect because they're very specifically targeted against Russians, and that's only a small part of the total anyway. There's still all that money that comes from, say, the Middle East, from the Arab countries, from China, because there's a huge number of wealthy people in China. And if you're a millionaire in China, do you really want to have all your liquid cash in that country where the Communist Party might be able to get its hands on it? I don't think so. You're going to do whatever you can to get it out of the country. And so unless there's a major change in British government policy, which would involve clamping down on the British Crown dependencies, I don't see that being much affected. I see you've also got a question about Northern Ireland, about the protocol and reunification. What is going to happen here? Well, basically, despite the, I think, utterly disingenuous comments that the British government has been making, once the UK had decided that it wanted to leave the EU single market, there had to be, and the EU has been absolutely clear about this, either a border in the island of Ireland between the Republic and Northern Ireland. The EU would impose this and insist that Ireland did, the Irish Republic did this, or there had to be a border, as there is now, thanks to the protocol, between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. There's no alternative to that. Now, the UK has threatened to tear up the protocol, which is not a light thing to do because it means derogating an international treaty, which is something that no sovereign state does lightly. But if they do, the EU will almost certainly impose, it'll treat the UK as a complete third country, as it's called. So it will suspend all of the various parts of the transition agreement, which are meant to alleviate the effects of Brexit, not leave the UK as a complete third country. That would have a major short-term impact on British trade. And so I think that the amount of shouting and screeching that would come from the City of London and various other places would be absolutely deafening. So I don't think the British government is going to do this. What I think, therefore, will happen is that the protocol will remain in place. Now, what effect will that have in Ireland? It's very hard to say, really. It destabilises the politics of the province, but I think myself that the Northern Ireland economy is now so strongly integrated with the rest of the Irish economy, the economy of the island of Ireland, in other words, that it's naturally moving towards reunification anyway. I'm sure the Irish government is basically praying like Saint Augustine, "Oh, let us have Irish unity, but not just yet," because I think the prospect of that would absolutely terrify them. But I think it probably is going to happen within about 10 to 12 years, is my view. If the British government was so foolish as to tear up the protocol, then I think it would happen very quickly, within less than 5 years, because there's a crucial block of Protestant voters in Northern Ireland, middle-class Protestant voters, basically, who are not any longer that attached to the Union of the UK. They prefer their standard of living, which depends very much on trade with the Irish Republic. So that's what I think the situation is in that regard.
Thank you, Stephen. And next question comes in from Aaron again. He asks, how do you see sort of a growing relationship sort of with non-EU countries, with Nordics, and obviously we have the Belt and Road Initiative from China as well. Now that we've decoupling from the EU, as you said, do these present a more sort of serious opportunity?
Well, this is the countries you mention are essentially the peripheral countries of the EU, the countries in the EU that are not in the Eurozone. Things like the Scandinavian countries, the so-called Visegrad group in Eastern Europe. Now, it may be that there is more trade or connections with these countries, but that's the problem is they're still in the EU single market, all of these countries. And so the problem from the trading point of view is that the barriers posed by regulatory divergence between the UK and the EU would still apply in their case. On the other hand, it could well be that there's closer political links. Now, all of those countries are very upset when Britain left. Why? Because they regarded the UK as being the force within the EU that kept a kind of check on the ambitions of the French, to be blunt about it. And that is no longer there. And the point is, I think there's going to be quite significant tension going forward within the EU between the French and the Germans on the one hand, and particularly Emmanuel Macron and the French, and some of these peripheral countries, because President Macron has been saying ever since he took office 6 years ago that he thinks the euro is not sustainable without something like a proper central government for the EU, which has tax and spending powers. I think he's completely correct about this, by the way. That was the big problem with the euro. They created a single currency without creating a single central tax and spending authority to go along with it. Pretty much every economist on the planet told them this was a bad idea, but they went ahead and did it anyway. So he wants to have things like a fiscal union and a common tax policy in certain areas for the whole EU. But he has a lot of opposition from these peripheral countries, these non-Eurozone member countries. One obvious solution would be to have a two-speed Europe, but the French political class and the German political class don't want that for various reasons. And so there's a question of, will those countries look to Britain outside the EU and form stronger links with Britain to try and get help of some kind to resist that? I doubt it myself, because I think that boat has sailed really with Britain having left the EU with Brexit. In terms of trade with non-EU countries, some of the countries with which I think you could see quite considerable growth of trade are ones that are close to Europe but not in the EU. Countries like Turkey, for example, Morocco, which is a very fast-growing economy, doing very well these days. And I would have said Russia, but of course that's definitely not going to happen now for obvious reasons. But other parts of Africa as well, notably the Middle East, where I think I would expect to see quite a significant growth in trade links of one kind or another.
Brilliant. Thank you, Stephen. And one final question. So to close us off nicely, do you see us rebuilding this relationship with the European Union? It will either end on a positive note or maybe not so much. What's your opinion on that?
I honestly don't know. And I'm, the point is, it depends so much on unpredictable events. And the thing is also that there are different kinds or areas of cooperation. I think security cooperation with the European countries, particularly with France, is actually going to become much stronger. Because my own view is that the war in Ukraine is not going to be over soon. I think it's going to be still going on in the middle of next year. It's going to settle down into a stalemate, I suspect, absent a Russian collapse or a Ukrainian collapse, neither of which I think is likely. So that I think is going to lead to a fundamental rethinking and reorientation of European security policy. So I think at the level of security policy, Britain is going to become much more closely connected to its European neighbours. We have certain things that they lack and vice versa. And if Europe as a whole is going to acquire the capacity to actually defend itself and not depend all the time on the Americans, then, and by so doing, achieve a certain degree of geopolitical independence of the United States, then that's a necessity. On the other hand, I think in the economic area, there's going to be an increasing divergence. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because as I say, the long-term trend for almost 20 years now has been for that to happen anyway. There are various reasons why the British economy is not as oriented towards the continent of Europe as it was in the post-World War II period. And I think that's quite likely to continue. It has to do with things like the global reach of the English language, the way in which British universities have very large numbers of students from parts of the world outside Europe, and things of that sort. The question is, does this happen with acrimony or without it, with a kind of mutually amicable agreement? And I think that depends entirely on highly contingent things like the personalities involved and the course of particular events. If people were rational and reasonable about this, then I think it should be perfectly possible to achieve an amicable outcome. The problem, I fear, is that in some cases this won't be true, and there'll be too much political point scoring and grandstanding going on both sides, I have to say, which could result in something seriously messy happening, in which case the reorientation I'm talking about would certainly be accelerated, but it would be very, very painful for 4 or 5 years before things settle down to a new arrangement.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I think that brings us nicely to a close this evening. So I'd like to extend our deepest thanks to Stephen for joining us this evening. It's much appreciated. Thank you for taking an hour out of your time on a busy Tuesday.
Thank you.
Is there any parting comments that you'd like to share?
Not really. I mean, it's And I just, good luck to anybody who wants to find out more about the details and the entrails of all this.
Well, thank you very much.